Even the elusive emperor was getting antsy with the impending doom of his nation. 5 months ago, the emperor already knew defeat was just a countdown. He feared retribution, using the war's downturn as an excuse. He dissolved his hawkish army-led cabinet, preparing an escape route like a wise old fox, ready to recruit the almost 80-year-old peace advocate, Lin Muken. Lin Muken, the emperor's trusty butler, enjoyed royal favor. More importantly, he was one of the rare peacekeepers who kept a low profile on overseas aggressions. The emperor fretted that if the army kept going rogue, by the time the US troops hit Tokyo, he'd be toast. He hoped Lin could tame those warmongers. At this point, the army still had 6 to 7 million troops, and the likes of Tojo were beating the drum for a last stand. Lin quickly sensed this was a brewing volcano. He didn't want to wear the war criminal badge at such a crucial moment, so he tried dodging the emperor's request. The emperor almost begged, leaving Lin no room to decline. Soon enough, Lin was set to be prime minister. Tojo Hideki from the army was the very first one to come knocking, prepared to collaborate with the majority of the cabinet members who came from a naval background. Aside from the Navy and the Army not getting along well, the US had already wiped out Japan's naval fleet. The defeated Navy was itching to end the war, but if Tojo stirred up a rebellion in the Army, Japan would definitely fall into a bottomless pit, making the choice of Army Minister in Lin's cabinet crucial. This person had to be reputable enough to keep the army in check and helpful in ending the war. No warmongers like Tojo were allowed. Lin himself visited the army ministry to meet Yoma Yoma. If the army didn't give their thumbs up, Lin's cabinet was a non-starter. The army minister and top brass had already guessed had put Annan in charge. Annan had previously been the emperor's military aide, so the army bigwigs didn't mind him joining the cabinet. They even laid out some harsh conditions, thinking that after the sinking of the Yamato, the navy had lost its status entirely. Japan should follow Germany's army-led, navy-aided policy, but its army was set against it. However, Annan appeared quite composed. He had already foreseen Japan's inevitable defeat. His younger son had been killed in battle, seemingly making him fearless now. He already saw the writing on the wall for Japan and felt even more resolute amid this army succession. Annan chose to stay home with family, while the Americans were not taking a break. Meanwhile, 500,000 US troops were gearing up to battle it out with the Japanese, and bombers had a stage to strut this stuff. Under the command of BBQ Master General Curtis LeMay, half of Tokyo was turned into ashes. If the US hadn't purposely dodged the Imperial Palace, the Emperor would likely have been toast. Lin realized that if they continued like this, surrender wouldn't even be necessary. Japan was already a scorched earth. He called for an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the next steps. Unexpectedly, Annan and the naval minister clashed right from the start, resulting in a standoff between army and navy with no room for discussion. Seeing that Lin Musk's cabinet was making slow progress, on June 22, Emperor Yuan had no choice but to convene a high-level military meeting. The emperor clearly stated the need for peace negotiations, with Lin in charge of the details. Army high-ranking officials couldn't openly disagree, but the former Prime Minister Tojo wasn't having it. He hurried over to the army department looking for Annan, only to find him absent, and then headed to the army staff headquarters. Tojo found the young officers and stirred them up to treat anyone wanting to surrender, including the emperor, as the enemy. The army started preparing to arm the populace with makeshift weapons. They even recruited schoolgirls for practice assassinations, gearing up to combat the northern forces on home. Japan's war machine had been rolling for years. Even the emperor couldn't just hit the brakes. Various factions were at each other's throats, while the army kept tearing each other apart. On July 27, things had reached a tipping point, with the Potsdam Declaration urging Japan to surrender ASAP. However, Japan dismissed the Potsdam Declaration, thinking they still had a shot without Soviet signatures. The declaration demanded a conditional surrender, yet Japan's leadership believed they could still bargain. On July 28, the Japanese government declared they were rejecting the Potsdam Declaration, but Americans weren't merciful. On August 6, 1945, they dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing hundreds of thousands instantly. A city was flattened in an instant, and this newfangled weapon left Japan in shock. 2 days later, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, sending 1.5 Red Army to northeast China. The Japanese were now teetering on the brink of annihilation. On the morning of August 9, Lin called an emergency meeting once more. At this point, Annan was heading to the Prime Minister's residence when young officers blocked his way. Although Annan didn't express much, he was an undeniable force to reckon with. If their demands weren't met, a mutiny was becoming more likely by the minute. Once the meeting kicked off, Prime Minister Lin was the first to state that Japan should surrender unconditionally to preserve the emperor's position. If they kept fighting, there wouldn't even be a Japan left on the map, and the Navy backed him on this. If you enjoyed our content, be sure to subscribe, like, and share. See you next time.